When Sophie, my girlfriend of 5 years, announced she wasn't coming back from her short work trip to Italy, I didn't panic. Long distance? We could manage it. But then I discovered she hadn't just fallen in love with the country. She had fallen for someone else. That wasn't the twist, though. The real shock came when she revealed her plans to stay weren't as innocent as they seemed. And that's when my fight for the truth began. A fight that unearthed betrayals far beyond anything I could have imagined. They say there's no worse silence than the absence of someone you love. I felt that silence the moment Sophie stopped answering my calls. The last thing she'd said to me before vanishing was, "I need to stay in Italy for a while. Please understand." At first, I convinced myself it was just wanderlust. Sophie had always been drawn to beauty, and Italy was a siren's song, art, food, sunlight that seemed to drip from the sky. She went there on a 3-month work assignment to help restore frescoes in an ancient villa outside Florence. It was supposed to be temporary, but now, 3 weeks without a call, not even a text. And then the letter arrived. I was sitting at our kitchen table in Chicago, staring out at the December rain, when I saw the envelope. It was postmarked from Venice, Sophie's handwriting unmistakable on the front. My chest tightened as I tore it open, scanning the words with growing unease. "Matt, I wish I could explain everything, but I can't. Not yet. There are things happening here that you wouldn't understand. Please know I never stopped loving you. Don't try to find me. It's safer this way. S." My hands trembled as I reread the note. Safer? What was that supposed to mean? For 3 days I tried to respect her wishes. But respect has its limits, especially when the woman you've loved for 5 years disappears with nothing but cryptic warnings. Couldn't let it go. The first thing I did was dig into her recent calls. Sophie wasn't careless. She wouldn't just vanish without leaving some kind of trail. Her work phone had been switched off for weeks, but her personal phone was another story. I found a series of outgoing calls to an Italian number, repeated over the span of several days before she went silent. When I dialed it, a curt male voice answered in Italian. "Chi parla?" "This is Matthew," I said, my voice shaky. "I'm looking for Sophie. Is she with you?" The man said nothing for a moment. Then, in English, "You shouldn't call here again." The line went dead. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in our bedroom, surrounded by Sophie's things, her half-read novels, her painting supplies, the perfume she always wore when we went out. It smelled like spring, light and fresh, but now it made my stomach churn. Something was wrong. Sophie wasn't the kind of person to get mixed up in danger. She was thoughtful, careful. The idea of her being in trouble didn't make sense, until I remembered something she'd said before leaving. We'd been lying in bed, talking about her trip. She'd mentioned the villa's owner, Alessandro Conti, an eccentric millionaire with a penchant for Renaissance art and a mysterious past. "He's intense," Sophie had said. "A little overwhelming, you know? But his passion for history is contagious." I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, the memory sent a shiver down my spine. By the end of the week, I'd made my decision. I booked a flight to Florence, packed a bag, and left a vague email for my boss about a family emergency. On the plane, I played through every possible scenario in my head. Maybe Sophie had fallen for someone else. Maybe she'd gotten into trouble she couldn't handle. Or maybe she just didn't want to come back to our life together. Each possibility hurt in its own way, but the truth turned out to be far stranger. I arrived in Florence under a cold, gray sky. The city hummed with life, tourists mingling with locals, street vendors shouting over the clatter of cafe cups. I took a taxi to the address Sophie had given me when she first started working here. Villa Sant'Orfeo, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. The gates were locked, the villa hidden behind a dense line of cypress trees. I buzzed the intercom, half expecting no response. A woman's voice crackled through. "Chie, I'm here to see Sophie Delacroix," I said, trying to sound confident. "She works here." There was a pause. Then, in clipped English, "Sophie is no longer here." "Where is she?" The woman hesitated. "You should leave, signore. This is not a place for you." The line went dead, and the gates remained shut. That night, back at my hotel, I stared at the villa's gates through Google Earth, trying to figure out my next move. The frustration was suffocating. It felt like Sophie was slipping further away with every passing moment. Then came the knock at my door. I froze, my mind racing. No one knew I was here, not even the hotel staff, since I checked in under a fake name. Cautiously, I opened the door. A young woman stood there, her face half hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. She slipped an envelope into my hand, whispered, "For Sophie," and vanished down the hall before I could ask anything. Inside the envelope was a single piece of paper. It wasn't Sophie's handwriting, but it was meant for me. "If you love her, stop searching. The villa is a graveyard for secrets." By morning, I decided to ignore the warning. If the villa was hiding secrets, then that's exactly where I needed to go. I returned to the gates, this time slipping through a break in the fence. The grounds were eerily quiet, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. I made my way toward the main building, skirting past windows and staying low. But just as I reached the side entrance, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. "Who are you?" The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp features that could have been chiseled from stone. "Matthew," I stammered. "I'm looking for Sophie." He studied me for a long moment, then released me with a scoff. "Come with me," he said. He led me into the villa, through winding halls filled with oil paintings and marble busts. Finally, we entered a dimly lit study. A man sat behind the desk, his gaze cold and calculating. "Alessandro Conti," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "So, you're Sophie's Matthew." The way he said her name sent a jolt of jealousy through me. "Where is she?" I demanded. Alessandro leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "That depends," he said. "How much are you willing to risk to find her?" I didn't trust Alessandro Conti the moment I saw him. There was something unnerving about his calm, deliberate movements, like a chess master evaluating the board before making his next move. He gestured for me to sit, but I stayed standing. "I'm not here to play games," I said. "Where's Sophie?" His eyes narrowed, though his smirk stayed fixed. "Sophie is complicated. She told me about you." "Oh yeah? What did she say?" "That you wouldn't give up." His words hung in the air, a challenge and a warning wrapped in one. I clenched my fists. "Where is she?" Alessandro exhaled slowly and leaned forward, clasping his hands on the desk. "She left the villa weeks ago. She told me she had to handle something dangerous. I haven't heard from her since." "Why would she involve you in anything dangerous?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Alessandro's smirk faltered for the first time. "Because she thought she could fix what I broke." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "Fix what?" He reached into a drawer and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the desk. I hesitated before picking it up. The picture was faded, black and white, showing a woman standing in front of a fountain. It was Sophie, or someone who looked exactly like her. "Her name was Valeria," Alessandro said. "She was my wife. She disappeared 50 years ago." My mind raced. "And you think Sophie is her, what, reincarnation?" "No," he said simply. "But there are similarities." Sophie even noticed it. She found this photograph in the villa's archives and demanded to know everything. "Why would that matter?" Alessandro hesitated. "Because Valeria didn't just disappear. She was taken." I sat down, the weight of the situation pressing on me. "Taken by who?" He tilted his head. "There are people in this world who collect beauty, Mr. Carter. They collect art, treasures, even people. Valeria was stolen from me by a man who thought she belonged in his collection." "And Sophie?" Alessandro's expression darkened. "Sophie found evidence that the man who took Valeria or his successors are still operating. She became obsessed with the idea of exposing them. I warned her to leave it alone, but she didn't listen." I leaned forward, anger bubbling up. "You let her walk into danger?" Alessandro met my glare without flinching. "I don't control Sophie. No one does. She made her choice." I stood abruptly, clutching the photograph. If you don't have answers, then you're no use to me. As I turned to leave, Alessandro's voice stopped me cold. Be careful where you search, Mr. Carter. Sophie told me you were determined, but determination often looks like desperation to the wrong people. If they find you before you find her, you'll wish you'd listened to her letter. I didn't respond. Couldn't. The air in the villa felt suffocating, and I needed to get out before I did something I'd regret. Back at my hotel, I stared at the photograph for hours. Valeria's face haunted me. The resemblance to Sophie was uncanny. The same sharp cheekbones, the same defiant tilt of her chin. But it was more than that. In the background of the photo, just barely visible, was a crest etched into the fountain's stone base. A lion's head surrounded by ivy. Jogged a memory. Sophie's journal. One of her final entries had mentioned something strange. If you ever feel lost, remember. Find the lion watching the water. The cryptic line suddenly made sense. The next morning, I returned to the villa, this time avoiding the main gate. I slipped through the same break in the fence and crept through the grounds, heading toward the garden. The fountain was exactly as I'd imagined. Majestic and weathered, its lion's head spouting a thin stream of water. I scanned the area for any sign of what Sophie might have left behind. It didn't take long. Hidden in the ivy near the base of the fountain was a small, rusted box. My hands trembled as I pried it open. Inside was a USB drive wrapped in a slip of paper. The note read, "This is the proof. Trust no one but Enzo." I didn't know who Enzo was, but I wasn't about to sit around waiting for answers. I returned to my hotel, plugged the USB into my laptop, and opened the only folder it contained, Valeria. What I saw made my stomach turn. Photographs of women, dozens of them, all posed like mannequins against opulent backdrops. Some were marked with red stamps that read "sold." Others had handwritten notes detailing dates, locations, and sums of money. Among the photographs were scanned documents, shipping manifests, transaction records, and emails. It was a detailed account of a human trafficking ring disguised as an art trade. And then I saw Sophie's name. She wasn't listed as sold, but one of the emails mentioned her by name. The Delacroix woman is becoming a problem. Handle her before she jeopardizes the shipment. My chest tightened as panic set in. Sophie wasn't just in trouble. She was a target. Before I could process what to do next, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You've been warned, Mr. Carter. Stop now or you'll end up like her." I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow on the walls felt like a threat. By dawn, I knew I couldn't face this alone. If Sophie trusted Enzo, then I needed to find him. I started asking around discreetly, mentioning his name in bars and cafes near the villa. Most people shrugged me off, but one old bartender hesitated when I mentioned Sophie. "She spoke of Enzo," he said, wiping the counter. "He works on the boats in Venice. A friend of hers, I think." Venice. Sophie's letter had been postmarked there. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. By evening, I was on a train to Venice, clutching the USB drive like a lifeline. Sophie's face lingered in my mind, alongside the cryptic warnings from Alessandro and the threatening texts. If someone was watching me, I couldn't afford to let them catch up. As the train rattled through the countryside, I stared out at the fading light, wondering if I was heading toward answers or into a trap. Venice felt like a dream soaked in shadows. The canals glistened under the moonlight, their rippling reflections distorting the grand facades of crumbling palazzi. As the train screeched to a halt at Santa Lucia station, I clutched the USB drive in my jacket pocket. My breath fogged in the cold air, but my pulse burned hot with adrenaline. Sophie's note had led me here. Somewhere in this maze of water and stone was the man she trusted, Enzo. I found him at the edge of the Cannaregio district, in a boathouse reeking of damp wood and diesel. He was older than I expected, his face weathered, his eyes a sharp, assessing blue. When I introduced myself, he studied me in silence, as if weighing whether I was worth the trouble. "I figured you'd show up," he said finally, his accent thick with the Venetian dialect. "You knew Sophie?" I asked. Enzo nodded. She was reckless, but brave. Too brave. Is she alive? He hesitated, then turned back to the small motorboat he was repairing. She was when I last saw her. That was 3 weeks ago. Where is she now? Taken, he said grimly, by the same people who took Valeria. And if you don't act fast, they'll make her disappear forever. Enzo led me inside his workshop, where maps and photographs covered the walls. He pointed to a photograph of a warehouse near the Venetian lagoon. They use this place to hold their shipments before sending them to buyers, he explained. Shipments? I repeated, the bile rising in my throat. Women mostly, Enzo said bluntly. Sometimes men. Treated like property, traded like art. He glanced at me. Sophie found this place. She broke in to collect proof. That USB drive you're clutching? It's the reason she's in danger. I tightened my grip on the drive. Why would she risk this? She believed it would end the cycle, Enzo said. But you can't stop men like these with proof. They own judges, politicians, the press. The only way to stop them is to burn their empire to the ground. Then we burn it, I said, my voice shaking. Enzo didn't argue. He handed me a flashlight, a map, and a gun. You're going to need this. I've never fired one, I admitted. Pray you don't have to, he said grimly. We set out in his motorboat, skimming across the dark waters toward the warehouse. The closer we got, the heavier the air felt. This wasn't just about Sophie anymore. It was about all the faces I'd seen in those photographs. People stolen from their lives, treated as commodities. The warehouse loomed over the water like a fortress, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. Enzo killed the motor and drifted toward a narrow dock. Stay quiet, he whispered as we climbed out. We moved through the shadows, slipping inside through a side entrance. The air was cold and metallic, the silence broken only by the faint hum of machinery. Enzo led me to a catwalk overlooking the main floor. Below, rows of shipping containers lined the space, some marked with the same lion's crest I'd seen on the fountain. She's in one of those, Enzo said. But we'll need to move fast. They're armed. How many? I asked. Too many, he said, his voice grim. We descended the stairs, sticking to the shadows. My heart pounded with every step. I gripped the gun Enzo had given me, praying I wouldn't have to use it. As we approached the containers, voices echoed from the far end of the warehouse. 2 men stood by a desk, rifles slung over their shoulders. Enzo motioned for me to stay back. He crept forward, his movements silent as a ghost. Before I could process what was happening, he lunged at the men, taking them down with swift, practiced precision. Clear, he whispered, beckoning me forward. We began opening containers, searching frantically. Most were filled with crates, artifacts, and stolen art. But then, as I opened a container near the center, I froze. Sophie was there, huddled in a corner, her wrists bound, her face bruised but alive. Sophie, I whispered, rushing to her side. Her eyes widened in shock, then filled with tears. Matt, what are you doing here? Saving you, I said, cutting through the ropes with a knife Enzo had given me. You shouldn't have come, she said, her voice trembling. Too late for that, I said, helping her to her feet. Before we could leave, the warehouse erupted in chaos. Shouts echoed through the space, followed by the crack of gunfire. Enzo appeared at the entrance of the container, his face set in grim determination. They found us, he said. Move. We sprinted toward the exit, ducking behind crates as bullets ricocheted around us. Sophie stumbled, but I caught her, pulling her forward. This way, Enzo shouted, leading us toward a service door. We burst outside into the cold night air, only to be met by more men waiting on the dock. Enzo raised his gun, firing with precision, but the odds were against us. Then, out of nowhere, a siren blared. Blue and red lights flashed across the water as police boats surrounded the dock. The men scattered, some diving into the lagoon to escape. Did you call them? I asked Enzo, stunned. He shook his head. No. But I'm not complaining. A voice boomed from one of the boats. Drop your weapons. Hands in the air. Enzo lowered his gun, his expression unreadable. Looks like someone else wants to burn this empire down. Hours later, Sophie and I sat in a cramped police station, wrapped in blankets. She rested her head on my shoulder, her exhaustion palpable. You risked everything for me? She said softly. I'd do it again, I said, though my voice was raw with emotion. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with guilt. I'm so sorry, Matt, for all of it. I thought I could handle this alone. I thought I was protecting you by keeping you out of it. We're in this together, I said. No more secrets. She nodded, her tears soaking into my shirt. The USB drive was handed over to the authorities, though Enzo warned us not to expect much. These men have power, he said. Real justice will take more than evidence. As Sophie and I boarded a plane back to Chicago, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The lion's crest, the photographs, the names, they were all part of something far bigger than we could comprehend. But for now, Sophie was safe, and that was enough.